Greetings, salutations, and words of goodwill. So I decided to take a break from what I have been doing the past few videos to discuss something that is in the news for the sort of people who follow this thing, which is not necessarily everyone, and that is that Jordan Peterson has recently released a playlist on his YouTube channel about his belief in the existence of God, or perhaps the lack thereof. And so seemed like something worth commenting on if you're going to comment on that sort of stuff. So what I thought I'd do is spend a little bit of time first discussing what it is exactly that he said, and then discussing sort of the traditional Christian method of discussing the same problem, which doesn't come to exactly the same conclusions as him, but is dealing with the same issue that he was discussing. And then finally, to sort of lay out a couple of critiques of exactly what position it is he seems to have taken at this point. So that's the goal, and let's go ahead and get started. The first thing to be said is describing what it is exactly that Jordan Peterson has said. And in the past, whenever he's been asked this question, his response has always been to dodge it, in essence. To say, what makes you think that that's any of your business, or what makes you think that you and I mean the same thing by believe, or even by God, which are actually fair things to say, because I think a lot of people have been questioning that very thing. But he seems to have taken a slightly stronger position at present, and what he's essentially saying is that he is committed to the existence of God, but not so committed to his existence that he feels comfortable actually saying that he believes it. Now, his reason for this is essentially that someone who really believed in the entity which traditional monotheists describe as God would behave in a certain way. Namely, that they would be actually morally perfect in some manner. Because if you really believe that there's a being who is all-powerful and all-loving and all-good, who created you and imbued into your soul an obligation to act in a certain way, then you would act in that way, especially if you believe that there are significant negative consequences to failing to behave in that way. Then the rational choice would be to avoid those negative consequences and choose the moral ones, or choose the better ones, which are the result of morality. Peterson then says about himself, "I am not morally perfect, and I do not wish to make claims to moral perfection." And as a result of that, he concludes, I must not ultimately believe in God. In essence, that he'd like to, but his own behavior indicates that there's something lacking in his belief, such that he does not want to assent to the proposition that he truly does believe. Peterson gets this idea, well, I shouldn't say where he specifically got it from, but in the Western tradition, this notion is usually attributed in one form or another to Socrates, whose position on ethics was often expressed as saying something along the lines of, no one willfully does evil. Anyone who behaves in a certain way must be convinced that that particular way is good for them. they could be wrong, right? And so in his mind, vice is ignorance. And on some level, well, I think that's ultimately mistaken. On some level, what Peterson is saying and what Socrates is saying makes some sense because if a here's just an example. If a father were to say to his son, "I believe that you are the sort of person who would not steal from me," and then he proceeds to put a lock on his liquor cabinet when he goes out of town, seems to be the case that he doesn't really believe what he said to his son, that he's not convinced it's true. Because if he were really convinced of that about his son, then he wouldn't take precautions against it. So there must be some part of him which doesn't really believe that his son isn't a thief, at least when it comes to unsupervised booze. Christians have been noticing this problem for a very long time. I don't think that Dr. Peterson would be the sort of person who would deny that, or that this is somehow he's the first person to have this thought. It might be the first time that he's willfully thought it through himself, but people who've been claiming to believe in God have noticed this about themselves as well. A religion which is so deeply rooted in a notion of sin couldn't fail to notice this problem. And so the way that Christians have traditionally discussed the topic of belief, you might say the topic of faith, and again, you'd think that we would have thought through faith quite significantly over and over again, is to, in essence, break it up into three categories. And the traditional explanation of this only makes sense if you begin to understand that in the traditional languages in which Christianity has been expressed, namely Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, the word for believe and the word for trust are essentially the same. And so to say that you believe something is to literally say that you trust in the veracity of it, right? Which again speaks to Peterson's point, because trust typically involves action, right? If you trust something, then you're willing to behave in a certain manner in relation to that trust, and so you trust the truth of a statement, and that's what it means to believe it. And if you believe it, if you trust it, then you'll act as though it were true. If you don't trust a bridge, you won't walk across it. So if you don't trust a statement, then you won't act on it. But needless to say, so you have to keep that in mind when hearing this. And of course, in Western Christianity, the language that is most desirable to use is always Latin. And so as a result of that, this topic has a specific Latin parlance, and not surprisingly, the distinctions that I'm going to discuss here are originally attributable to Augustine, because, that's just how Western Christian theology works. Everything comes back to Augustine in some way or another, at least typically speaking. So Augustine makes this distinction, and he uses different formulations of the word faith and God in Latin in its grammar in order to express differences and nuances in meaning. If you don't know the Latin grammar, it's not really that important. I'll essentially translate it into English in a way that is coherent and cogent. So the first type of belief or faith that Augustine discusses is credere Deum, which is, credere is the Latin word for to believe, or to have faith, or to trust, and Deum then is the word for God. So Deus is the word for God, but Deum makes it a direct object. It's an accusative. So to say that you have credere Deum is to say that you believe that God exists. In the Latin, that's really what that means. I believe, to believe that God exists. And this is sort of the most simple form of faith, in a sense, simple form of belief. And it's the initial, you might say, assent of faith that's necessary to move forward at all. This is what in modern epistemology would be called propositional knowledge, or you could say propositional belief in our context. Typically, it would be referred to as knowledge that, or in this case, it's obviously belief that. And so, in essence, what it means is that I assent to the proposition that follows, right? So I believe, and then you say the thing you believe, and what you mean is that you assent to whatever proposition follows as a description, an accurate description, obviously, of the world external to your mere perception of things. That you believe that this expression corresponds to what is actually there, and that you assert that honestly. So when that sense you say, I believe in God, what you mean is that you believe that there is this entity and that he is existing. He has existence. The next phrase that Augustine will use is credere Deo, which in Latin essentially means that I believe God, right? And it means it in the sense that you normally say it. Like if I said I believe Steve, what I mean is that when Steve said something, I thought that it was true, right? And it involves a personal level of trust in the person, such that when they speak, you don't think they're lying, right? And it's not only that you don't think they're lying, so you also don't think they're wrong, right? They are neither lying nor wrong. You believe them, and this sort of faith is absolutely necessary on a regular basis in human life. It might seem a little silly on some level because typically this sort of belief is the bedrock of statements, essentially like, well, I believe this because the Bible says so. And some people find that incredulous, unbelievable. The problem is that once you've already established that God is real, and once you've already established that the Bible is his word, then the only rational thing to do is to actually believe what it says, to believe him when he speaks. Now, it's silly on some level to make such arguments to people who don't believe that God exists or that don't believe the Bible is his word, right? But if you're going to accept those two as axioms, then it's really stupid to not believe it just because the Bible says so. Okay? And there's no point in getting into it here, but there are good reasons for accepting those two axioms. And so, where I think a lot of disagreement's not really the right word, where a lot of annoyance between both believers and unbelievers occurs here is that, like, you have an unbeliever speaking to someone who rejects those axioms, or you have a unbeliever who, like, doesn't understand that once you accept those axioms, you should just believe things because the Bible says so. It's stupid not to. And actually, a lot of times you have people who claim to be believers who don't understand that either, which is 10 times worse. And unless you want to go like whole hog flat earther, right, where you don't believe something unless you've seen it yourself, everyone functions with this level of faith on some level or another, this level of belief, right? We all believe other people when they say things to us, even though we have not seen the thing they say is true directly for ourselves. And, like, for example, right, if Dr. Peterson says that on average men are less agreeable than women, he's a professional psychologist. He has a doctorate in that field. And he's also, generally speaking, if you've followed him, not the sort of person who lies or speaks inaccurately intentionally. In fact, he's a little anal oftentimes about not doing so. And he has his reasons for that. And I'm not criticizing him for it. But what it means is that if he said it, that he's an expert in the field, so you presume he knows what he's talking about. And he's intentionally not only not deceptive, but excessively accurate in his speech, to the point that even when he knows something, he'll give some sort of qualifier to just say, well, could be wrong. So if he said it, then it's not unreasonable to believe him. Now, maybe you want to double check his work. Fine. But even if you do that, you're not going to run the experiments that he's referencing on your own, right? I mean, you could, but most people don't have the money or time or resources necessary to do that. And so even if you go and find the actual scholarly works that he's referencing and read those yourself, you're putting faith in those individuals as not lying and as following good methodology, and as having employed the methodology they said they did, et cetera, et cetera. So you're always going to have this credera plus the dative, credera Deo type faith, either directed at God or other people. The third type of belief or faith that Augustine describes is credere in Deum. Now, as far as I can tell, this particular grammatical construction is just a poor translation into Latin from Greek. But Augustine, I think, notices this and decides that he's going to sort of leap on it and use it. And traditionally, what I would say this particular form of faith means is to trust a person. And not in the sense that not like in even the remotest propositional sense that we mean when, like I say, I believe Steve, right? Or I believe God. That would mean that I believe what he's saying. But in this instance, it would be more like in English saying, I trust in you. I have faith in you. In this sense, like imagine a daughter walks into a room and says to her mother, I want to go to this party, and I know that it could cause problems, but here's all these reasons why I don't think it's going to be an issue. And she just keeps going on and on and on about all of the steps she's going to take so that she doesn't come home drunk or pregnant or whatever. And at some point halfway through, her mother just stops her and says, you don't have to keep talking like this. Like, you can go to the party. I trust you. Right? That's not a propositional thing. This is some form of WH belief or WH knowledge, right? So not a knowledge that something is true, but something more like knowing how to do something or knowing who someone is. In this case, trusting a person is different than believing a proposition. And so the mother's saying to her daughter, like, I have faith in your virtue, right? I trust in your morality or your common sense or whatever it is that you have. It's going to cause you to make the right decisions in this, and so just go. Or in another instance, I think you probably got the idea, but a son's trying to learn how to ride his bike, right? And he just falls over and he says, I can't do it. And his dad looks at him and says, like, no, I have faith in you. You can do this. And so that's a personal faith. And that's what Christians mean when they say a personal faith, right? That you trust the person. And traditionally, what Christians would say is that, it's very easy to believe that God exists. Peterson's sort of implying otherwise, but I think this is dealing with the same problem that he's getting at. Traditionally, it's very easy to claim that God exists, as the Epistle of St. James says. Even the demons do that, and it causes them to tremble. Right? So it's not hard to believe that God exists. The thing that is difficult is to trust that thing you believe exists. And that is really what Christians mean when we say that we're saved by faith. I mean, I'm a Catholic, so I believe we're also saved by works, but it's a big deal that we're saved by faith in a very significant manner. And what we mean is not so much, although obviously this is going to be necessary to do almost anything, that we assert certain propositions as true, that we assert that Jesus is our personal Lord and Savior, or we assert that God exists, or we assert that the crucifixion is salvific, but rather that we actually trust God as a person, that we believe that he has the power to do something for us, and we think that he will because he's a nice guy, in a sense, because he cares about us, and he's trustworthy. And what Christians will typically say is that I'm still working on that. And so what it would mean to be fully saved would be to actually do that, to actually trust God to that degree. And then if you trust him like that, you have the capacity now to actually follow him full on, to actually behave in the way that Peterson describes someone who really believes in God will behave, right? And it's not like I don't think he's real, or I do think he's real. It's like I believe that guy has my back, because that's just the sort of dude he is. And Christians will typically say, I'm still working on that, right? I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. And so the whole Christian life, in essence, is in moving further and further and further into that act of credere in Deum. But it necessitates an initial credere Deum, because it's very difficult to trust a person you don't think exists, right? I suppose you could, but most people won't, and that's reasonable, to not trust someone that isn't there. So I don't think that fully addresses Peterson's epistemological quandary in relation to what constitutes belief versus not belief in relation to action and assertion, which I'll get to a little bit more in a second. But I do think that it really does address his ethical concern, which is really more fundamental, at the very least, to what he's saying is going on here, right? That he doesn't feel worthy of saying that he believes in God because on some level that faith is clearly defective, because he still sins in some way or another. He doesn't fully behave like someone who would believe it. At this point, I'd like to sort of transition into maybe a criticism of his position that he takes here. And the point that I want to make to start out with, there's 2 points really. And the first is that people often, on a regular basis, do things that they know are wrong, behave against the things they believe, that they are convinced something is right for them, and they do the opposite, or something other than this. And Dr. Peterson actually acknowledges this in his interview with Dennis Prager around minute 18-19 or so, when he says that he believes people are actually not rational, right? That the problem with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins is that they think that if everyone just stopped believing in God, most of them would be like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. And the reality is most people wouldn't be like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Most of them would do something else. And the reason for that is that human beings, and this is actually where Plato fails in his thought process here, is that human beings are not merely rational animals, right? I know that's Aristotle's word, but in essence, Socrates agrees with that. Human beings are also volitional animals. We have free will, we have the capacity to choose, and we have wants and desires, which are not 100% in our control. And as a result of that, oftentimes people believe one thing is true, but they want something else to be true. Or they know something with their head, but they have not convinced their heart that it's true. They don't feel that it's true. And so it's entirely possible. I'm not saying it's always the explanation for what's going on, but it's entirely possible to assert the truth of something honestly and mean it, and at the same time to simply choose to act in contradiction to that. That's just the way that people are. So, listen, I have no idea whether or not Dr. Peterson does believe in God or not. I think what I take from it is that he's on some sort of, on the edge of being willing to assert that he does. And he's uncomfortable with that. And so he doesn't quite want to say it, and this is one reason why he's uncomfortable with it. Probably others. But he's overcome those to some degree, and this is the last thing that he's struggling with. But it's entirely possible that were he to simply say, I believe in God, and mean it and be honest, and it would be true when he said it, he could still not be morally perfect, because there's probably some part of him that doesn't want to be. And I'm not criticizing him individually. Like when Christians say that we're fallen, when Catholics say the Hail Mary and say, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death, when we call ourselves sinners, that's what we mean, in part at least. There's also like an historical thing when we have sinned in the past, but for the most part we mean we aren't fully on board. And the other problem is that he seems to conflate assent to a proposition with the mere act of stating that it's true, which is not the same thing, because people can lie, right? And as essentially what he's saying is that if you assent to something and then don't act as though it's true, you're actually lying, that you don't really believe that. And it's like, yes, you do, on some level, like, right? You're not lying, you're just a hypocrite, which is different, because it's possible to speak dishonestly on purpose, right? To intentionally speak dishonestly. And so when you assert something, you're not assenting to it because you know it's a lie. Or even if you don't know it's a lie, you don't believe that it's true, and whatever that means. And so he's failing to make that distinction, and it has consequences. And I'd add, one of those consequences is that it can actually turn people away from that proposition you think they should be consenting to more strongly. Just as an example, I don't doubt that Dr. Peterson would consent to the proposition that lying is immoral. And yet he asserted that for a certain portion of his life, he was not living that out. Now, when he realized that and attempted to turn away from that aspect of his behavior, he could have taken the same tact and said, well, I'm committed to the idea that lying is wrong, but because I still occasionally act deceptively, I don't want to claim that I'm perfectly honest in every way, I don't know that I can really say that I believe lying is wrong. And of course, the natural consequence of that for the person you're talking to, unless they really understand the nuance of your position, is that you actually think it's okay to lie on occasion. Like that your position is actually lying is sometimes all right, which is not what you want to say and not what you want to communicate. Now, the second thing that I would criticize Dr. Peterson for is that he's still evading the question a little bit. And I don't, it's far less intentional, I think, now than it was in the past when he was just saying, like, that's not a question you get to ask me, right? Just obviously intentionally evading the question. And why do I say that? Because what most people want to know when they ask him this question is it sufficient to merely behave as though God existed? Or is that a stupid thing to do if there isn't actually a God out there, right? Do you think that in the way Jordan Peterson uses the word metaphysically, although I think he probably means more accurately ontologically, that there's a God? Like in the same way that St. Paul says, if Christ isn't resurrected, then our faith is in vain. Because you can take the crucifixion story and the resurrection story, and you can take the moral behind it, and the beauty behind it, of struggling uphill, as Dr. Peterson says, as being willing to speak the truth in the face of destruction, and of the rebirth of that, that results from that, right? You can take that as real, and it might be true in a sense that that's how the world works, but it's a completely different question to ask. Do you think Jesus physically died and was crucified, which I presume Dr. Peterson does, because it's stupid not to believe that. And then, do you believe that he actually physically rose from the dead? Right? When people are asking him, do you believe in God? They aren't asking him, do you fully live out the crucifixion story in your everyday life? Right? What they're asking him is, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Physically? Was he there in his body eating that fish on the side of the Sea of Galilee with his apostles? That's the question. And it's not an irrelevant question, because the question itself is that historical fact relevant? Is the ontological existence and not merely the metaphorical existence of God relevant? Because it has seemed to many people that Dr. Peterson does not believe that it is ultimately relevant, although it might be some interesting fact. I was actually recently discussing this topic with someone that I know, and we were discussing what faith means, and then in relation to Jordan Peterson, and it said, it seems to me that Dr. Peterson is promoting not any of those three traditional methods of credere that we discussed earlier in the video, but rather a credere in ideam Dei, right? A trust, like a personal trust, but not in God himself, but in the idea of God, in having God as a thought. So if you think of God in your everyday life, that you should trust the act of thinking as opposed to God himself. And it seems to me that Jordan Peterson is on the verge of moving from that to an actual credere in Deum, which would first require a credere Deum, which he's not quite willing to say yet. And the reason I say that is it's still not clear what it is he means by God itself. For example, in his speech in Sydney that he gave around an hour and 16 into it, he says, in relation to belief in the existence of God, he says, I mean, agnostic, atheist, I don't really care. The purpose, the point is something like this. Imagine something of ultimate transcendent value. I don't care whether you believe in it or not, but imagine that something like that exists, and then swear your allegiance to it, which is to say, I believe in this. Right? In that instance, what he's saying is that he's not sure he fully believes in the idea of God. Imagine this thing, right? All that matters is that you can imagine it. It's the epistemic reality, the internal reality that's important, and not the external reality. So that's what he says in Sydney. Now, I don't know, maybe a month or so later, when we get to his interview with Dennis Prager, what he says is, it's not unreasonable to associate that value that is intrinsic in humanity with something that's metaphysically real, that's part of the structure of reality itself. Now, that might actually mean that he is asserting a belief in God and moving towards a credere in Deum, or a credere Deum, as opposed to a mere credere in ideam Dei, in the idea of God. And if, to be clear, if he's asserting merely an idea, a belief in the idea of God, then what that means is that the underlying structure behind that idea is not God, right? Not in the sense that Christians mean it, or Muslims or Jews for that matter. It must be some underlying structure of reality which is purely natural. And that's usually the way that he describes the biblical stories, etc. He does so in a very compelling manner, and I believe there's probably some connection between God and those underlying structures, whatever that might be. But then again, his Prager comment could simply mean that. At best, these structures are God constrained to his most immanent aspects of himself, completely stripped of his transcendent existence. I think this question of whether or not God actually exists, or merely the idea of him is a good approximation of what exists, such that behaving as though he existed is better for you than behaving as though he doesn't, is in fact the pivotal question, and it remains unanswered. Now I want to close by saying that I actually have a lot of deep respect for Dr. Peterson. I don't just watch his stuff in order to be critical of it. It's got to be very difficult for him to take any stance publicly, because as a friend of mine recently said, there are people who actually care what he thinks. And I don't mean that in the sense that they think his ideas are interesting or something, but that they're actually following him. That they think that that if he says something that that's a good reason to live it out, or to adopt it, and they're not stupid for that, because he's quite a brilliant man who's doing quite spectacular stuff. But when you have that sort of power, you have a lot of responsibility in the wielding of that power. And I don't want to criticize him for being cautious. I don't want to criticize him at all, really. But the ideas that he's expressing in this particular instance are wanting in some way, and I think it's worth commenting on, because that's how you move dialogue forward. And I think that he would acknowledge that his answer is not complete. He regularly says things like that. I think in this instance, this is where its lack of completeness is at. And so I also think that as Christians, we need to be praying for him, not simply because he seems to be on the cusp of making a sincere act of faith, and Christians think that's important for people to do, and so it'd be good to pray for him in that regard. But also simply because, as I said, he's standing up to a lot of crap, and he wields a lot of power in influence in people's lives, and you just need support when you're in that situation. And he could use it from God, because we all could, in addition to needing it from other people. And so I think that we should do that little which is in our power to support him, and to beseech God for him in that respect. So anyway, I hope you found this useful, beneficial, otherwise interesting. And if so, subscribe, and comment below. And until next time, God bless and have a great day.